Good morning. My name is Daryl, and I'm one of the pastors here at South Langley Church. It's good to be with you again this morning. Thank you, Doug, for reading. How many of you enjoy the home improvement type TV shows, those reality shows? Be honest. They're kind of interesting, engaging. Back in 2008, there was a show that came out, a TV show that ran for only one season, and it was called The Big Reveal. And what they did was they took all the reality shows of that time, and they kind of combined them and cut out all the stuff that you don't like to see and showed you the exciting befores and afters, including all those little design tips and things that we find quite interesting. Since then, of course, you don't have to look too far through your channels to discover that there have been dozens and dozens of other of those types of reveal shows. Extreme Home Makeover, Love It or List It, Property Brothers, Homes on Homes, and more recently, Maureen and I have got to enjoy this one now, Island of Brian. And it just goes on and on. What is it about these that they all have in common? It's the before and after transformations. The anticipation of something wonderful, something amazing, the change, the improvement, and then, of course, the surprise and wonder of what will be. Anybody watch the Raptors game last night? I watched until they were down about 14 or 15 points. Then I thought it's time to review my sermon. And when I came back a while later, the Lord blessed me by they were only down by 2. So then I kept watching. And very exciting. Had any of us been able to reveal what the outcome was at the beginning of the game, probably wouldn't have had to watch it. But it was very exciting to see the conclusion and how they fought their way back and eventually won the game. There's something about that anticipation, about what's going to be. But there is something else that's interesting about these reveal TV shows. And that is, before you have that big reveal, there's always a period of waiting. And that's the question this morning. Is it worth it? Is the wait worth it? And we're going to find out as we look at Jesus' final reveal to his disciples. As we saw last week in chapter 20, this was probably the ending to the book of John. But somehow we got an extra chapter tacked on. An epilogue. Now, before you get too uptight about this, let me assure you that it is legitimate. All the scholars agree that chapter 21 does fit, and it's in all the early manuscripts. So we're safe there. And I'm really glad that John included chapter 21 in his gospel, because in it we discover more of Jesus' plan for the world, his purpose for the disciples, and how the gospel is going to be infiltrated in the midst of all that's going on. We also see more of Jesus' heart as he reveals more of who he is and as he prepares to leave the disciples. Then, of course, chapter 20 ends with John telling us, as we saw last week, the purpose for writing his gospel. He says, the disciples, let me open my Bible here. The disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. It's all about believing. Believing that the reveal is real. Chapter 21 gives us more evidence to the fact that Jesus is truly risen from the dead. So I want to break the story down into 3 parts this morning. And the first part we're going to look at is what I just call waiting for Jesus. Our passage begins with the word later. Jesus appeared again to the disciples. Now the word appeared in the Greek is a much stronger word and should be understood as manifested or revealed. In fact, the original text uses that word twice in verse 1 and then again once in verse 14. And so a better reading would be this: Later, Jesus manifested himself to the disciples, and this is how he manifested himself. Jesus is about to make himself more fully known as the risen Son of God. And the idea is very similar to what Jesus did in John chapter 13, where he washed the disciples' feet. There we read, a few weeks ago, he had loved his disciples during his earthly ministry, and now he loved them to the very end. And if you've got an NLT translation, you look down, there's a footnote, and it says, he showed them the full extent of his love. So there's no doubt that Jesus has been revealing himself all along. But now, after he has risen from the dead, he wants to more fully reveal himself to his disciples. In fact, our passage ends in verse 14 with these words. This was the third time that Jesus revealed himself. So why these reveals? Well, remember, all through his ministry with the disciples, Jesus was preparing them for when he would leave them and go back to the Father. His goal in these reveals is to leave little to no doubt as to who he is as he prepares to go away. He is going to instill confidence in them and empower them to carry out the work of ministry after he is gone. Now, it's important to note in our text where this revealing takes place: the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias. This may sound familiar. This is where Jesus calmed the storm. He walked on the water. He fed the 5,000 on that very shore. It's also where several of these disciples originated from. It was their home area. It's where Jesus began his earthly ministry. It became kind of their base of operation, if you will. And so how appropriate that Jesus would choose to end his ministry where it all began. It just makes sense. But there's a potential problem. Why? Well, we need to look at Matthew chapter 28, verse 16, where Jesus says, just before he commissions them, then the 11 disciples left for Galilee, going to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. Now, if you count the number of disciples listed in our text, it comes out to 7. Some say maybe there was 8. So where were the others? We don't know. The text doesn't tell us. But that's not the problem. The problem is the disciples were by the sea when Jesus had told them to go where? To the mountain. Could it be they got tired of waiting? Were they bored? Hungry? Or was it just natural that they would return to what they were familiar with while they waited? Because remember, several of these men were fishermen by trade. Whatever the reason, it's very interesting to note that Jesus never condemns Peter or the disciples for being on the sea. And so while they wait, Peter announces that he's going fishing, to which the others reply, "We'll come too." I guess they were bored as well. Now, some scholars jump on Peter at this point, suggesting that he was rejecting his call as a disciple and returning to his former occupation. I don't agree. I think he was like many of us. He needed something to do while he waited. It's hard to wait. In fact, very few of us like to wait. Maybe you're waiting on news about a health issue, about a job interview, about potential acceptance to college, or whether an offer will go through on your dream home. Or maybe you're just waiting for that Amazon package to arrive. Whatever it is, the point is not to become lazy while waiting. The answer will come. Jesus will reveal himself. Just wait. That's a promise. Jesus will reveal himself. Just wait. And like the wait in the before and after TV shows, this one is so much better and so worth it. Well, as we read, the fishing trip was unsuccessful. All night they try and come up empty. Now, if this sounds familiar, it should. Back in Luke chapter 5, on this same body of water, they had a similar experience of fishing all night and catching nothing. Possibly, Jesus is repeating this scene in order to help them remember and recognize him as the same Jesus they knew before his death. At very least, it is setting them up to realize that they are completely dependent on him to supply their needs. Reminds me of the passage back in John 15 that I preached a few weeks ago, 15 verse 5, where Jesus says, "Apart from me or without me, you can do nothing." What are you trying to do in your own power? Is it working? Let me suggest, when circumstances are darkest and we feel hopeless as we wait, that is when we are in the best position to experience Jesus. When all seems hopeless, that is when we're in the best position to experience Jesus. Second part of our story, recognizing Jesus. We come to what I say is the heart of the story, and the main reason I believe John includes it in this epilogue. It is at their deepest point of disappointment, when they are fatigued, frustrated, failed, and famished, Jesus appears on the shore and calls to them. And remember, this was part of his plan all along, to have them wait in Galilee so he could reveal or manifest himself more fully. And as he calls to the disciples on the water, he uses an interesting greeting in Greek. The NLT says, "Fellows, have you caught any fish?" The NIV uses the word friends, but the better word in the Greek is the word children. And why I think that's significant is in using this word, you would think that the disciples would have recognized Jesus' voice. So why don't they? Well, some scholars believe that Jesus' appearance was physically different or changed after the resurrection. And I think there's an element of truth to that. You remember Mary at the tomb? She didn't recognize Jesus initially. And then later, on the road to Emmaus, the two disciples walking, they didn't recognize Jesus either. In our story, possibly it's just too dark. Or maybe they were too far away from the beach to make out who this person was. Or, how about this thought? They weren't looking for Jesus. They were so focused on themselves and on what they were dealing with that they missed the very person that they were told to wait for. How easy it is for us to miss Jesus in the busyness and activity of our everyday lives. Are you looking for Jesus in the midst of your storm or your battle? Well, it's also important to note that Jesus words the question in such a way as to require a negative answer. In the Greek, the wording reads like this: "Children, haven't you any fish or food?" You haven't any fish or food, have you? Why does he word it this way? I believe because he wants the disciples to have to admit to their own failure and defeat. Because when they do, they are then open to the suggestion, yes, even the command, to cast their net on the other side of the boat in verse 6. It's the same for us. We need to come to that place of admitting our weaknesses and failures before Jesus can bring healing. But it is at their lowest point, when they are feeling fatigued, frustrated, failed, and famished, something incredible happens. A miracle, in fact, the only recorded miracle after the resurrection. Now, to help us understand a little bit better about this miracle, I need to give you a little Galilean fishing lesson. First of all, there was probably two boats, and what they would do is they would cast out a compound net, which was circular. It would hang down in the water, cork floaters on the top and some kind of weights on the bottom, and it would be used to encircle the school of fish. Once that happened, then they would cast another net out on top of the water with weights, and that would come down over the school of fish. And they would tighten that, and then either a swimmer would start tossing them into the boat, or they would pull the whole net onto the boat. Why is that significant? Maybe you're seeing the point. Jesus' command to cast the net on the other side of the boat would have seemed utterly foolish to these experienced fishermen. There was no enclosed net on the other side of the boat. In other words, there would be no school of fish waiting to be caught. When you think about it, just casting a net, by that time it hit the water, those fish, you know how fish go, they would have been gone. And that's what makes this such an incredible miracle, because immediately the net is filled with large fish, too heavy to drag to the boat. What did it take? One word: obedience. How many miracles have we missed because we did not obey? You know, I think often the difference between success and failure is the width of the boat. That's all it takes. Well, it's at this point in the story where something clicks in John's brain, and he begins to think to himself, wait a minute, this is no ordinary man on the beach. I've seen this before, and there's only one person that could pull an incredible feat like we've just witnessed. And in his excitement and exuberance, he calls out to Peter, "It is the Lord." What an incredible aha moment. And John wants his readers to catch the significance of this statement. Now think about it for a minute. Jesus could have simply called out from the beach, "Hey boys, it's me, Jesus, your risen Messiah." But instead, he chooses to reveal himself in a way that leaves no room for doubt as to who he is, to his identity and his power. This is all about recognizing Jesus for who he is. And this is also why John uses the word manifested or revealed in verses 1 and 14. He wants us as his readers to understand that this person is none other than Jesus the Messiah, the risen Son of God. Peter's response is also worth exploring when he hears that it's Jesus. If you think back again to the story in Luke chapter 5, in that story where Jesus is calling the disciples to follow him, when they see the miracle of fish, in that instance, Peter's response is, "O Lord, please leave me. I am a sinful man." So why the change? I believe it's because he now sees the fuller revelation of Jesus as he appears after the resurrection. And he's starting to put these pieces together. He's also had a lot of time to think about his denials, and I wonder if he sees this as an opportunity to try to make things right. In fact, it is even possible that Jesus set this whole thing up as part of the lesson in waiting. I think sometimes we need to sit in our mistakes for a while before we are ready to face them. That's not easy, but sometimes we need to sit in those mistakes. Well, now that Jesus has revealed himself, Peter can't get to him fast enough. What is your response, my response, when I see Jesus? Now, we need to understand something about Jewish culture. It was not acceptable to be in a hurry or in a rush. In fact, it was considered undignified to give the impression that you were late. It showed that your life was out of order, in chaos. Remember the story of the prodigal son? When the father saw the son coming down the road, what did he do? He ran to him. Old men didn't run in Jewish culture. But the father didn't care. Just like Peter did not care either. He just wanted to get to shore as fast as he could and be with Jesus. Is that your sole desire? To be with Jesus? What's standing in our way this morning? Then we come to the third part of this story, fellowshipping with Jesus. The text says that when they get to the shore, they see something. And I'm sure they were surprised to see a fire and fish roasting and bread. First, a comment about the fire. John specifically records that it was a charcoal fire. If that sounds familiar, it should. During Jesus' trial, back in John chapter 18, we read that Peter was warming himself by a charcoal fire. Do you think Jesus is making a statement here? I doubt that Peter would have missed the significance of this scene of forgiveness and restoration. You come back next week, there'll be more on that as we wrap up the Gospel of John. Then a comment about the food. Text doesn't record how Jesus got this food, but that's not what's important. Let's not miss the significance of the fish and bread. Back in John 6, we saw Jesus feeding the 5,000 on this very shore with fish and bread. And if there was any doubt in their minds as to whether this really was Jesus, there would certainly have been no doubt after what they had just experienced and then recalling the earlier miracle. Then Jesus asked Peter to bring some of the fish they caught, possibly to add to the ones that were on the fire, but more likely as a personal invitation to share in the meal together. And isn't that so like Jesus? When we are feeling fatigued, frustrated, failed, and famished, Jesus meets us at our point of need. When we are at our worst, he is at his best. This reminds us that Jesus doesn't need our help, but he welcomes our involvement. Remember the little boy with the 5 loaves and 2 fishes? Jesus didn't need that small boy's lunch, but he sure enjoyed using it. Well, before they eat, there's one more piece of business that needs to be taken care of. The text records here in verse 11 that Peter went and dragged the net to shore, probably into a man-made catch basin by the shore, so that the fish would stay fresh for cleaning and then taken to market for selling later. Specifically, it records that there were 153 large fish, and yet the net did not break. There's been a lot of speculation over the years as to the significance or symbolism of this number 153, and we could spend the rest of the morning debating about this. But let me just share one explanation that I found interesting and I think might be a possibility. When Jesus first called his disciples on the shore of Galilee in Matthew chapter 4, he said, "Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people." And then in Matthew 13, he says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a fishing net that was thrown into the water and caught fish of every kind." Matthew 13. One of the early church fathers, by the name of Jerome, wrote that there were 153 known species of fish at the time of Jesus. It is possible that Jesus may have been using this analogy of 153 to symbolize that the gospel message is for all people and all nations. Many scholars feel that this number is spiritual and a reference to the gospel bearing much fruit in the future. I would like to suggest that the number of fish is not the focus, but rather the miracle of abundance and Jesus' care for his disciples. I think this is the key. In Judaism, an abundant catch of fish was a symbol, an indication of God's favor and blessing. And this is what Jesus is doing here. In revealing himself, he is blessing his disciples and reminding them of his care for them. Just when they had given up hope of catching anything, maybe even of seeing Jesus again, he appears and restores their faith in him. Likewise, I don't believe this story of the fish is meant as a sign for unbelievers to believe in the resurrection, but for the church, for us, to see our responsibility and work in the world, namely to reach the lost and bring them into the kingdom of God. And here at South Langley, we like to use the phrase, as Dave mentioned already this morning, engage the city. I don't know if you know this or not, but next month, the city of Langley is hosting several public engagement events to discuss the growth and expansion of the Booth, Fernridge, and Rynn neighborhoods. And the final one is an open house, and it is taking place right here in our church. What an opportunity for us to engage with our city. The population growth that was predicted many years ago, when I was here 20 plus years ago, is finally coming our way. And we are strategically located in the center of this. Will we find ways to be engaged and to be salt and light to our neighbors? Why don't we start praying about that now? For opportunities to build relationships with those who are coming. More specifically, as we heard in the announcement time, there are some incredible opportunities coming up in the next 6 weeks to engage the city. And I want to encourage us to take those to heart, to be praying, to look for ways where we can step in and volunteer. And yes, sometimes we see them as an inconvenience. But if we truly want to be a church that engages our city, then we need to step up and take the challenge and see these opportunities as opportunities to allow people to see more of who Jesus is, and we reveal Jesus to them. Our passage ends with Jesus inviting the disciples to a meal. And we've heard of the Last Supper. We could call this the Last Breakfast. And I love how John records here in verse 12, none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. So any previous doubt was erased. Just like that. There was nothing left for them to question. Not because they're about to eat a meal with him, but because he has more fully revealed himself to them in a more personal way than ever before. I want us to catch this. This was a personal encounter with the risen Savior. This was a personal miracle designed to show that he was the Messiah. And this is a personal invitation to true fellowship with Jesus, the Son of God. It was like another communion moment that the disciples had experienced with Jesus breaking the bread and serving wine in the upper room. When is the last time you've had a personal encounter with Jesus? Do you long for this? He is ready to reveal himself. What a comfort and encouragement it must have been for those men after all the confusion and uncertainty surrounding Jesus' death and resurrection. This time on the beach speaks to intimacy and to fellowship with Jesus and with the Father. Don't you think this simple meal on the beach would have been the best meal they'd ever tasted? And maybe Jesus is inviting you to a meal. Will you join him? I'm going to invite the worship team and prayer team to come up and prepare to end our service. Jesus has revealed himself. Do you see him? Can you hear him calling? Following the 3 parts of our story this morning, let me say it this way. He's calling you in the wait. And maybe you're tired of waiting. You just need to surrender to him. He will come as you wait. What do you need to release to him this morning? He's calling you on the water when you're fatigued, frustrated, failed, and famished. He asks you to cast your net, your frustrations, your fears, your worries, and your concerns to the other side of the boat for the answer or the miracle that you are looking for. He wants to meet you at your deepest place of need. Will you obey? He's also calling you into fellowship, to enjoy breakfast with him. And this speaks of intimacy and friendship. Do you long to just be with Jesus? Maybe this is your aha moment as you recognize Jesus for the first time, or as you see him revealed in a fresh new way this morning. Jesus is calling. Will you respond? As we sing together, I invite you to come for prayer. And sometimes we think, I can't go forward for prayer. My problem isn't that big. Or maybe you're afraid to come forward because of what others will think. Well, you do have a huge problem. And maybe you want to pray for someone else or express praise to God. All are welcome. As we sing, come and share in the fellowship Jesus is offering. Let's sing together.
Would you